Hello again everyone, welcome back for another lecture video. Today we're going to be talking about visuals, how they can be rhetorical, and how they can create meaning. So to do that, we're going to talk about the article Towards a Theory of Visual Argument, and that outlines some of the ways meaning can be created through images. So with your websites for this unit, you have the option to use a variety of visuals, and it's important to not just throw those in at happenstance, but we want to be thinking about what those images mean and how we can use those effectively in the context of our projects. So we're going to be talking about that today. And for our next class, there is another article for you to read, the last one of the semester, and it's Burke's Representative Anecdote as a Method in Mass Media Criticism. So with that article, that talks specifically about how we can use pieces of multimedia, how they can create rhetorical meaning. And again, with these websites, you're not just limited to static visual images. You can use a variety of multimedia in your projects. So it's important to think about those as well as with the website, with the genre of websites in general. It's easy enough to integrate like music or clips from your favorite TV shows. But again, just like with visuals, we want to be thinking about what do those mean rhetorically and how can we effectively use those in the context of our projects. So that's what we've got going on for class today. Before we get started today, I have a forum post option for you. So the article Toward a Theory of Visual Argument makes a lot of good points and brings up a lot of salient issues related to visuals, how they create meaning, and what their place is in the world. So in this article, the authors note that there is a prevalent prejudice that visual images are in some intrinsic way arbitrary, vague, and ambiguous. This presumption encourages the view that visual images are less precise than words, especially the written word. So what you could do with the 200 and 250 words you have is think about what are your general thoughts on images as a tool for communication. Do you feel that images can be interesting and insightful about the world or any subject that we would normally use words to discuss? Do you feel images can be as expressive, potentially more expressive, or maybe less expressive than words? Or are images too vague to have a consistent, concrete meaning? So take some time, ponder this quote, think about what your thoughts are, maybe write a little bit, include some examples to back that up. And this is just an option you have as you consider what images might potentially mean. So as we move this discussion forward, the next thing I have for you is a TED Talk that talks in some detail about images and how they can work in the greater context of a story. Because that's what we want to do when we're using images, is not just throw them out there to stand on their own, but really contextualize them deep within a larger story, a larger narrative that we're trying to create. You might watch that video first, or you might do some writing first, watch that video, and then come back to what you have written. But this video should be an interesting way to begin our discussion on visual images.
Let's just start by looking at some great photographs. This is an icon of National Geographic, an Afghan refugee taken by Steve McCurry, but the Harvard Lampoon is about to come out with a parody of National Geographic, and I shudder to think what they are going to do to this photograph. Oh, the wrath of Photoshop. This is a jet landing at San Francisco by Bruce Dale. He mounted a camera on the tail. A poetic image for a story on Tolstoy by Sam Abel. Pygmies in the DRC by Randy Olson. I love this photograph because it reminds me of Degas' bronze sculptures, The Little Dancer. A polar bear swimming in the Arctic by Paul Nicklin. Polar bears need ice to be able to move back and forth. They're not very good swimmers, and we know what's happening to the ice. These are camels moving across the Rift Valley in Africa, photographed by Chris Johns. Shot straight down, so these are the shadows of the camels. This is a rancher in Texas by William Albert Allard, a great portraitist. And Jane Goodall, making her own special connection, photographed by Nick Nichols. This is a soap disco in Spain, photographed by David Allen Harvey. And David said that there was a lot of weird stuff happening on the dance floor, but hey, at least it's hygienic. These are sea lions in Australia doing their own dance by David Dubélé. And this is a comet captured by Dr. Ewan Mason. And finally, the bow of the Titanic, without movie stars, photographed by Emery Christoph. Photography carries a power that holds up under the relentless swirl of today's saturated media world, because photographs emulate the way that our mind freezes a significant moment. Here's an example. 4 years ago, I was at the beach with my son, and he was learning how to swim in the relatively soft surf of the Delaware beaches. But I turned away for a moment, and he got caught into a riptide and started to be pulled out towards a jetty. I can stand here right now and see, as I go tearing into the water after him, the moment slowing down and freezing into this arrangement. I can see the rocks are over here. There's a wave about to crash onto him. I can see his hands reaching out, and I can see his face in terror, looking at me, saying, "Help me, Dad." I got him. The wave broke over us. We got back on shore. He was fine. We were a little bit rattled. But this flashbulb memory, as it's called, is when all the elements came together to define not just the event, but my emotional connection to it. And this is what a photograph taps into when it makes its own powerful connection to a viewer. Now, I have to tell you, I was talking to Kyle last week about this, that I was going to tell this story. And he said, "Oh, yeah, I remember that too. I remember my image of you was that you were up on the shore yelling at me." I thought I was a hero. So this is a cross sample of some remarkable images taken by some of the world's greatest photojournalists working at the very top of their craft, except one. This photograph was taken by Dr. Ewan Mason in New Zealand last year, and it was submitted and published in National Geographic. Last year, we added a section to our website called Your Shot, where anyone can submit photographs for possible publication, and it has become a wild success, tapping into the enthusiast photography community. The quality of these amateur photographs can at times be amazing, and seeing this reinforces for me that every one of us has at least one or two great photographs in them. But to be a great photojournalist, you have to have more than just one or two great photographs in you. You've got to be able to make them all the time. But even more importantly, you need to know how to create a visual narrative. You need to know how to tell a story. So I'm going to share with you some coverages that I feel demonstrate the storytelling power of photography. Photographer Nick Nichols went to document a very small and relatively unknown wildlife sanctuary in Chad called Zakoma. The original intent was to travel there and bring back a classic story of diverse species of an exotic locale, and that is what Nick did up to a point. This is a serval cat. He's actually taking his own picture, shot with what's called a camera trap. There's an infrared beam that's going across, and he's stepped into the beam and taken his photograph. These are baboons at a watering hole. The camera, again, an automatic camera, took thousands of pictures of this, and Nick ended up with a lot of pictures of the rear ends of baboons. A lion having a late night snack. Notice he's got a broken tooth. And a crocodile walks up a riverbank towards its den. I love this little bit of water that comes off the back of his tail. But the centerpiece species of Zakoma are the elephants. It's one of the largest intact herds in this part of Africa. Here's a photograph shot in moonlight, something that digital photography has made a big difference for. It was with the elephants that this story pivoted. Nick, along with researcher Dr. Michael Fay, collared the matriarch of the herd. They named her Annie, and they began tracking her movements. The herd was safe within the confines of the park because of this dedicated group of park rangers. But once the annual rains began, the herd would begin migrating to feeding grounds outside the park, and that's when they ran into trouble. For outside the safety of the park were poachers who would hunt them down only for the value of their ivory tusks. The matriarch that they were radio tracking, after weeks of moving back and forth in and out of the park, came to a halt outside the park. Annie had been killed, along with 20 members of her herd. and they only came for the ivory. And this is actually one of the rangers. They were able to chase off one of the poachers and recover this ivory because they couldn't leave it there because it's still valuable. But what Nick did was he brought back was a story that went beyond the old school method of just straight, isn't this an amazing world? And instead created a story that touched our audiences deeply. Instead of just knowledge of this park, he created an understanding and an empathy for the elephants, the rangers, and the many issues surrounding human-wildlife conflicts. Now let's go over to India. Sometimes you can tell a broad story in a focused way. We were looking at the same issue that Richard Werman touches upon in his New World Population Project. For the first time in history, more people live in urban rather than rural environs. And most of that growth is not in the cities, but in the slums that surround them. Jonas Bendixson, a very energetic photographer, came to me and said, we need to document this, and here's my proposal. Let's go all over the world and photograph every single slum around the world. And I said, well, that might be a bit ambitious for our budget. So instead, what we did was we decided to, instead of going out and doing what would result in what we consider sort of a survey story, where you just go in and see just a little bit of everything, we put Jonas into Dharavi, which is part of Mumbai, India, and let him stay there and really get into the heart and soul of this really major part of the city. What Jonas did was not just go and do a surface look at the awful conditions that exist in such places. He saw that this was a living and breathing and vital part of how the entire urban area functioned. By staying tightly focused in one place, Jonas tapped in to the soul and the enduring human spirit that underlies this community. And he did it in a beautiful way. Sometimes, though, the only way to tell a story is with the sweeping picture. We teamed up underwater photographer Brian Scarry and photojournalist Randy Olson to document the depletion of the world's fisheries. We weren't the only ones to tackle this subject, but the photographs that Brian and Randy created are among the best to capture both the human and natural devastation of overfishing. Here in a photo by Brian, a seemingly crucified shark is caught up in a gill net off of Baja. I've seen sort of okay pictures of bycatch, the animals accidentally scooped up while fishing for a specific species. But here, Brian captured a unique view by positioning himself underneath the boat when they threw the waste overboard. And Brian then went on to even greater risk to get this never-before-made photograph of a trawl net scraping the ocean bottom. Back on land, Randy Olson photographed a makeshift fish market in Africa where the remains of filleted fish were sold to the locals, the main parts having already been sent to Europe. And here in China, Randy shot a jellyfish market. As prime food sources are depleted, the harvest goes deeper into the oceans and brings in more such sources of protein. This is called fishing down the food chain. But there are also glimmers of hope. And I think anytime we're doing a big story on this, we don't really want to go and just look at all the problems. We also want to look for solutions. And Brian photographed a marine sanctuary in New Zealand where commercial fishing had been banned, the result being that the overfished species have been restored, and with them a possible solution for sustainable fisheries. Photography can also compel us to confront issues that are potentially distressing and controversial. James Knockway, who was honored last year at last year's TED, took a look at the sweep of the medical system that is utilized to handle the American wounded coming out of Iraq. It is like a tube where a wounded soldier enters on one end and exits back home on the other. Jim started in the battlefield. Here, a medical technician tends to a wounded soldier on the helicopter ride back to the field hospital. Here is in the field hospital. The soldier on the right has the name of his daughter tattooed across his chest as a reminder of home. From here, the more severely wounded are transported back to Germany, where they meet up with their families for the first time. And then back to the States to recuperate at veterans hospitals such as here in Walter Reed. And finally, often fitted with high-tech prosthesis, they exit the medical system and attempt to regain their pre-war lives. Jim took what could have been a straight-up medical science story and gave it a human dimension that touched our readers deeply. Now, these stories are great examples of how photography can be used to address some of our most important topics. But there are also times when photographers simply encounter things that are, when it comes down to it, just plain fun. Photographer Paul Nicklin traveled to Antarctica to shoot a story on leopard seals. They have been rarely photographed, partly because they are considered one of the most dangerous predators in the ocean. In fact, a year earlier, a researcher had been grabbed by one and pulled down to depth and killed. So you can imagine Paul was maybe a little bit hesitant about getting into the water. Now, what leopard seals do mostly is they eat penguins. You know of the march of the penguins? This is sort of the munch of the penguins. Here a penguin goes up to the edge and looks out to see if the coast is clear, and then everybody kind of runs out and goes out. But then Paul got in the water, and he said he was never really afraid of this. This one female came up to him. She's probably, and it's a shame you can't see it in the photograph, but she's 12 feet long. So she is pretty significant in size. And Paul said he was never really afraid because she was more curious about him than threatened. This mouthing behavior on the right was really her way of saying to him, hey, look how big I am, or, my, what big teeth you have. Then Paul thinks that she simply took pity on him. To her, here was this big, goofy creature in the water that for some reason didn't seem to be interested in chasing penguins. So what she did was she started to bring penguins to him alive and put them in front of him. She dropped them off, and then they would swim away. She'd kind of look at them, go, what are you doing? Go back and get them, and then bring them back and drop them in front of him. And she did this for over the course of a couple of days, until the point where she got so frustrated with him that she started putting them directly on top of his head, which just resulted in a fantastic photograph. Eventually, though, Paul thinks that she just figured that he was never going to survive. This is her kind of just puffing out, snorting out in sort of disgust, and lost interest with him and went back to what she does best. Paul set out to photograph a relatively mysterious and unknown creature and came back with not just a collection of photographs, but an amazing experience and a great story. It is these kinds of stories, ones that go beyond the immediate or just the superficial, that demonstrate the power of photojournalism. I believe that photography can make a real connection to people and can be employed as a positive agent for understanding the challenges and opportunities facing our world today. Thank you.
I hope you all found that video insightful as we begin our discussion on images and how they create meaning. So that video did a nice job discussing why you really want to work on having images work in the context of a greater narrative, as the speaker discussed throughout a whole different stories that appeared in National Geographic. With that in mind, if we want to use images effectively within a narrative, it's important for us to understand how they create meaning. We need to pause and think about how any piece of media, image, video creates meaning, and think about how our audience is going to interpret that. Because while you might see an image or a piece of media meaning one thing, a member of your audience, someone reading your website, might see something drastically different from what you interpret. So we have to be sure, or at least as sure as we possibly can, because we can never have 100% certainty. We need to think about what sentiments our images might convey to our audience. And again, this all comes back to audience, which is super important at any level of communication. Otherwise, we run the risk of having our intentions backfire. But how do we understand images? So as we go through the next several slides here, I'm going to talk about a lot of different ways images can create different kinds of meaning. So as we begin to think about how images create meaning, it's important to understand that there are different levels of meaning that are created and different levels in which we understand what something is trying to tell us. The first level of meaning we are going to talk about is denotative meaning, which is the literal face value of a sign. So when you're using an image, what does it mean at the most basic level? What does it mean when we're talking literally? Not what it means symbolically, not what it might mean culturally, but just what does it mean when we look at it? So an example that I have up on the lecture notes right now, if we have a picture of a rose, the denotative meaning of that is that of a flower. We're not thinking about the deeper symbolic meaning behind that at this stage of meaning. Rather, we're just looking at this rose for what it is, a physical object in nature, a flower, nothing more than that, nothing deeper than that at this stage of meaning. Now, aside from that, the deeper, more interesting form of meaning to think about is connotative meaning. And this stems from the social, cultural, and historical meanings that are added to a sign's literal meaning. So, while a picture of a rose, a denotative meaning might just mean that it's a flower, a connotative meaning might go deeper than that, thinking about like gardens, Valentine's Day, things like that. And connotative meaning relies heavily on your audience's lived experiences, knowledge based on past events. So, an example for connotative meaning I have up on the slide right now is a picture of a dove. Literally, a dove at the denotative level is just a bird, but when we think about the connotative meaning, the symbolic meaning of doves, people might look at it as a symbol of peace. And there are some more examples for you to think about with these various levels at the end of the lecture notes today, but this is the kind of thing I want you thinking about, I want you comprehending with these various levels of meaning so you can use images effectively. A big part of understanding how connotative meaning comes to be is understanding the ideology of your audience. So it's always important to be thinking about who your audience is, what their expectations are, what kind of experiences they might bring to your piece of communication. So for the websites we're working on, you're trying to build something perhaps more professional to get a job interview. So it's important to think about what's the ideology of, say, like an HR manager or someone who might be interested in hiring you or looking into your serious academic work. Ideology is the shared set of values and beliefs that exist within a given society and through which individuals live out their relations to social institutions and structures, the way certain values and concepts are made to seem like natural, inevitable aspects of everyday life. So essentially, what does the world around us condition us to think? How do the systems that are currently in place change the ways we perceive reality? So a couple examples I have up on the slide right now: capitalist societies versus communist societies. How do they perceive how government should operate? What government should do for people? Another example: northern states versus southern states. What's their perception of what the government should be doing? What should religious institutions be doing? Another example, which might be more salient depending on where you're from and if you're from the state, is the ideology created by someone living in or near Chicago versus the rest of Illinois. So all these examples, it's important to think about who is your audience, where are they coming from, what are their expectations. So that's why with this is something we've stressed all year, the importance of thinking about your audience, thinking about what their expectations are, because if you really want to understand how they will potentially take up or understand your images, you need to think about the ideologies they're bringing to your websites. To put all this another way we can perceive or think about images is on 3 different levels, and that is the sign, signifier, and signified. So images create meaning at a variety of different levels. So if we want to think seriously about what our images might be saying, what our media might be saying, it can be a very useful tool to step back and think about it at these 3 different levels. Now, this is very similar to what we talked about with denotative and connotative meaning. It's just nuanced a little bit more with the addition of the signifier. So when we're talking about sign, we're talking about the actual object. What are we looking at? That's the denotative meaning. Signifier is what words can be used to describe the object, and signified is the connotative meaning. What is the philosophical or cultural meaning assigned to the object? So up on the screen now, there is a breakdown of an apple at the 3 levels of sign, signifier, and signified. So as we can see, the sign, the object, the thing, what are we actually looking at? There's a picture of an apple right there, so that's the most basic level. And signifier is the physical existence. So what words can be used to describe what we're looking at? So the examples they have up there are red, leaf, round, I think it's more oblong than round, but whatever. And apple, the actual word we have to describe this piece of fruit. And then taking that a step deeper to the signified, the mental concept. So when we're thinking about apples, what do they mean? Fruit, freshness, healthy, temptation, teacher's pets, which in all my years of teaching, I've never actually seen anyone be given an apple. That just seems super weird. Also, computer, if we think about Apple, maybe you're watching this on a MacBook. I'm creating and editing this on a MacBook right now, so if when I think of Apple, that's probably the first thing that's going to come to my mind instead of fruit. But depending on where you are, if maybe you're in a country where Apple isn't a socially cultural powerhouse where everyone has iPhones, MacBooks, things like that, maybe fruit is going to be the first thing to come in mind. And this is a really interesting concept to keep in mind just because we have something simple. Apple can have so many different meanings. And this is important, and these are the kind of things I want you thinking about as you're contemplating what images you want to use for your websites. So before I get into the extra credit part, I do have one additional forum post prompt for you. So this gives you another option, or if you want to write 2 forum posts, however you want to go about it. So after discussing visuals today, how are you going to incorporate them into your website? What do the selected images you have to say, what might they say about you? How might they reflect you as a person, as a potential employee? And you could also think about how can you use these images in conjunction with other rhetorical appeals we talked about throughout the semester, namely ethos, logos, and pathos. So with the images you're using on your websites, how might other people interpret these? Or just how can you use images or other multimodal features in your site? So that last part will be easier to answer after our next lesson on multimedia. So consider this forum post. Feel free to write on this or the other forum posts I mentioned earlier in the video, or both. It's entirely up to you. Just giving you some options as we near the end of the semester. And for the final thing we've got for you today, I do have a little bit of extra credit for you all. So what I am looking for you to do is you can work on your own or in a group, it's up to you. And what I want you to do is select 2 images and break down their meaning at each of the 3 levels we talked about today: sign, signifier, and signified. And what I want you to do is write down some notes on each of these levels and discuss it either in your groups or on your own, and talk about what the images mean to you and talk about what potential changes, what different levels they might have in terms of meaning at the signified level. So for this extra credit, you can post it through the forums, and this will count as an extra forum post. So if you're short on those, definitely look into doing this to make up some credit that you have. So what do these images mean potentially philosophically at a deeper social meaning? So I have some questions for you to consider as you're discussing or contemplating signified. So think about, what does the image mean to you? What are the other possible meanings that this image might have? How might other people perceive what they're looking at? Are there any specific audiences that might have a strong reaction to this image? And what kind of contextualization might you need to properly represent these images? So at Signified, I want you to pause and consider, at a deeper level, what might these images mean? How might a variety of audiences understand what they're looking at? That's all for today. Check out the images, have some fun reflecting on them, and remember to keep working on your websites as we near the end of the semester. Okay, so that is it for today's video. Hopefully you learned a few things about visual rhetoric, so there's a few forum post options for you as well as some extra credit. So keep this in mind as you're building your websites, as you're using and integrating images.